Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Markish and I am the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Stress-Free SQL Queries for the Analyst. Today's featured speaker is Ben Boy, Systems Consultant with Quest Software. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes including a Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I would also like to say thank you to Quest Software for sponsoring this event. At this time, I will turn over to Ben to get us started.
Adrian, thank you so much. Welcome everyone. As Adrian said, my name is Ben Boyce. I am a systems consultant with Quest Software. And here is my goofy grin. So not only will you hear me as a goofy person, you will also see that I am physically goofy. So I just have to apologize for that in advance. Just a little bit of background on myself. I've been involved in the technology field really for about 15 years. The last 3 have been as a systems consultant with Quest Software. Prior to that, I had a lot of different roles. I've done software development, software testing, system support, application support, all kinds of different stuff. And what's really pretty neat is one of my first jobs was actually as an analyst. And we actually had a weekly data push process, and my job was, after that process was complete, to actually clean up the data. So I had to deduplicate it, I had to locate items that were missing from records, all to ensure that by the time we got around to generating our monthly, our quarterly, our semi-annual, and annual reports, obviously the data was clean and reflecting of the correct information. So along those lines, part of our agenda is really going to be discussing some of these common challenges. Now, I'm going to discuss some of the challenges that I faced. I'm going to discuss some of the challenges that I've learned in talking to a lot of folks that traditionally fall into the sort of analyst role. And I understand that analyst is a very, very broad term. And so we're going to be thinking of folks that just deal with data. Now, I know there's a lot of different operations within that, but you can understand some of the challenges in trying to be fairly broad. And then we're actually going to be discussing how we can alleviate some of the stress associated with our job, in particular on focusing on some pretty basic things with regards to SQL syntax. And that can be a real unfortunate reality of our lives, is that because we are dealing with data, we're going to have to deal with SQL syntax in some fashion. All right? And as a result of that, one of the things that we're going to discuss in particular is how we can use Quest Software's Toad for Data Analyst to really kind of take control of our code. So there are going to be a lot of features that we're going to talk about in terms of having a solution set that can actually generate SQL syntax for us, that will allow us to actually get our hands on the SQL syntax, to be able to perform queries across multiple database platforms, and steps that we can take to automate redundant tasks that we may be facing. And as Adrian said, I'm definitely going to ensure that I leave enough time at the end for some questions and answers, because honestly, that's my favorite part of these types of discussions, is really finding out what types of questions everyone has. Now, I love this concept of being a data detective. And in many cases, that kind of, our jobs feel a lot like having to detect and hunt things down and really kind of understand what in the world's going on. What's really pretty interesting is when I did my analysis work, I was technically employed as part of the technology department in the company. But what I was having to do was to actually translate information and present it in a format that could be understood by folks that would be considered more business-centric. So these would be, account managers, sales reps, and actually even some of the executive management within the company. So really what we're learning as analysts is that we are really bridging the gap between technology, if you will, and the business, and we're having to do that sort of translation in terms of the raw data and being able to present it in understandable fashions. Now, I've also worked with folks that were business analysts that were supporting many of our development efforts. So these folks were actually responsible for having to assemble a lot of the requirements associated with next evolutions of our software cycles. And in many cases, these folks needed to be able to understand the underlying data structures that we're dealing with and how they could accurately represent, how it runs now or how it exists now, as well as, what it should do at some point in the future. And in many cases, if you're just staring at raw data, I can look at raw data using just about any solution. That doesn't always help me really understand what's going on, right? So I do have to put forth some effort in terms of being able to translate that into some acceptable format. And in many cases, we're having to use SQL code to do that. Now, I will freely admit that I am one of the worst persons in using SQL syntax. I have no problems admitting that fact, but the reality is, as part of that analyst function, we're expected to at least have some level of proficiency with SQL syntax. Now, I'm really kind of curious if some of these points really resonate with a lot of you. In many cases, we're pretty lucky if we're only having to deal with a single data source. Now, a data source could be a variety of things. It could be our Oracle database platform. It could be our SQL Server. Heck, it may even be Access and Excel files. All right? And each one of those different data sources will a lot of times provide us with native tools that will allow us to work with it. But for those of us that may be having to try to make sense of data spread across different data sources, that becomes a bit of a challenge because these data sources don't like to talk to each other in many cases. And each tool set for each data source presents its own intricacies, its own challenges, and if I'm working with 5 different data sources, I may have to learn 5 different ways to approach the data. And then I've got to be kind of the central assembly point to piece together those information and supply it in a format that really makes sense to whomever's requesting it. Now, I hope that no one on this call is falling into this sort of third category, which is really having to rely on somebody else to deliver that information, right? So maybe you're hands off the data. You're having to rely on somebody else in the organization. Maybe it's a programmer friend of yours, or heaven forbid, you're having to rely on the DBA to grant you access to that information or even to deliver that information to you. Because guess what? As far as their priority list is concerned, the information we need is at the bottom of the barrel. We're lucky if it hits into the top 50 things of items that they're responsible for throughout the day. So what does that really create? That creates a huge bottleneck in terms of being able to support the business. And the reality is the business pays the bill. So we need to make sure that we can do our job as quickly and easily as possible. Now, in terms of just understanding where the data is, if you're dealing with multiple platforms, as I said, trying to understand the intricacies perhaps of the native tools that are provided there to make sense of it, to try to picture where data is located, to understand what the underlying structures look like. And the reality is we're probably not just writing pretty straightforward queries. We're having to do something that's probably a bit more complicated, right? That involves some inner joins, some outer joins, or some various where conditions, and maybe it's not even that simple. Maybe it's completely more robust. As we're working with SQL syntax, not only are we trying to write it, but we're having to read it, right? I don't know if you've ever run into this situation where someone says, hey, Ben, can you generate this sort of information from me? And it's kind of a one-off thing, or so you think, right? So you produce this information, and you don't hear anything for 2 weeks. And what happens? Well, 2 weeks later, they come back and go, hey, Ben, do you remember that query that you wrote for me? And maybe you do remember that query, but maybe you don't. So assuming that you did find it, you may have to kind of look through it and try to really understand what it was that you were trying to accomplish. Right? Uh-oh, what was I doing here? Why did I do this? Why did I do that? Or if you're working with additional teammates, you get to a point where you're like, Ben, I got a hold of this syntax that you wrote, that you willingly shared with me, but I have no idea what you're trying to accomplish. So we're also having to read these queries throughout the day, right? That can be really, really challenging. So what are some things that we can do when it comes to dealing with SQL syntax that maybe are some pretty fundamental things, very straightforward things that can alleviate some of this stress? Let's talk a little bit about syntax. All right, how many of you are using uppercase code conventions for keywords in your SQL syntax, like select or from or where, something along those lines? All right. What about formatting your SQL syntax? How many of you are formatting it in a way that makes your code more readable? How many of you are commenting your code? Aha! Commenting your code. Well, I don't need comments. I know exactly what I'm trying to accomplish until I don't touch it for 2 weeks. And then I come back to it and go, oh man, what was I thinking? Right? Or on the flip side of that, you get a hold of some SQL syntax that one of your teammates wrote, and you have no idea what's going on because it's some mass of select, of subselects, of subselects, of subselects with no particular formatting and no code formatting. And then what are you having to do? You're having to start at the smallest level possible and execute that piece of it and then kind of back out to get the complete picture. That's a nightmare. So some things with formatting, perhaps uppercasing keywords and commenting our code can help alleviate a lot of those challenges. How many of us have been guilty of doing a select star from a table, in fact, maybe just to understand what the bloody columns are in that particular table? I've done it. It's not a proud moment for me, but it's something that we may have to do. All right? Well, if I'm dealing with smaller data sets, okay, probably not as big a deal. But if you're dealing with data sources that have, 500,000 of rows, right? Millions of rows, we're really increasing the stress of the database itself. So perhaps maybe we should actually focus on selecting the appropriate columns that we really need. Well, what does this mean? This means we need to be able to understand what those columns are. Okay. Now, for those of us that are having to kind of repeat processes over and over, I know I've been certainly guilty of using hard-coded values in my SQL syntax, right? Well, what happens if all of a sudden those hard-coded values have to change? Well, I've got to edit the syntax and re-execute the query to get the information I need. To make it more generic, one thing that I may want to be able to do is perhaps use something along the lines of bind variables. Now, anytime I need to go ahead and execute that query, I can just simply type in the values that I'm really looking for, and I've made this a bit more repeatable. Right? There are also things that maybe our data sets aren't that dynamic. Maybe these are things that we're having to execute on a regular basis and perhaps export these results in sort of Excel formats or something along those lines. Well, there are things that we can do to automate these tasks to make our lives a little easier. And here may not be necessarily the best example of some of the things that I've talked about, but perhaps instead of writing code like we see above, which is really not terribly easy to read and is not using a consistent syntax with some of these key words, we can use that sort of uppercase concept. We've got a little bit more formatting here that makes the code a little easier to read. And we're actually using bind variables for looking for items that don't exist in our particular query. All right, so some things to kind of think about. Now, I've really been setting myself up here, haven't I? All right, so we're going to be discussing how we can use Quest Software's Toad for Data Analysts to address many of these concerns that we've been talking about, rather that I've been talking about along the way. All right, so if you'll bear with me 1 second, I'm going to go ahead and Alt-Tab over into my demonstrative environment. And then I'm going to go ahead and put myself into full screen mode. And what everybody should be seeing right now is basically Toad for Data Analyst. More particular, we're actually taking a look at the quick guide, which is displayed on this screen. Now, this quick guide is actually pretty nice because it describes some of the core concepts and the core functionality of the solution Toad for Data Analysts. There's also a workflow that is built into this solution. So if you are finding yourself having to run through kind of an understand your environment, query that environment, assemble the results into some sort of report, and then wanting to be able to automate these different tasks, maybe that workflow makes sense to you. But one of the great things about this particular solution is I'm not confined to this particular workflow. I can enter different functions within the solution at any point. And what I think you'll really see with a solution like Toad for Data Analysts is that there's a nice mixture of simplicity and power. So from this kind of core concept of understanding the environments that we're working with, well, there's a couple of approaches that are available to us. We might be very, very visual people, right? And we need to understand tables and their relationships, perhaps graphically. Right? So there are ways that we can generate diagrams that really help us understand the table relationships that we may have to work with. And for those of us that need a more detailed view of the underlying objects that we're going to have to work with, there's a database explorer that allows us to do that. When it comes to querying these environments, for those of us that might want to save some time or that might need a little help in actually writing a SQL syntax, there's a graphical query builder that actually generates the SQL syntax for us. For those of us that really are more hands-on, that may be comfortable in working with SQL syntax, we can take a very, very hands-on approach and actually write our own SQL syntax using a fully functional editor. Now, when we're having to present information in ways that make sense, there's a couple of options here. There's a Toad report. A Toad report is a bit more like Crystal reports. Now, I'm not saying it is Crystal reports. It's like Crystal reports in that it provides us with some graphical interface to actually build a particular report, and then, of course, we can offload that into some other format if that makes sense. I'm learning the more that I talk to folks that are kind of dealing with data that Excel seems to be a very, very common format that people are using to output information. And we're going to see heavy integration with Excel in this particular solution. And then finally, we're going to discuss ways that we can automate certain tasks and, in fact, offload them to a schedule on our local machine that we could execute at some other time to save us some steps along the way. Right? But one key thing that I didn't even mention just yet are the different data sources that I can connect to. So if we take a look at the different data sources that are available to us here, we can see that we can connect to some of the big three, right? Oracle, SQL Server, DB2. Some might argue that Sybase and MySQL are also pretty big, and I would agree with that. You can also connect to other data sources like Access and Excel. I'm still amazed at how many data sources like Access and Excel still exist out there. And for those of you that may not see your data source of choice, just be aware that there is the ability to use ODBC to connect to those data sources. So within a single sort of interface, I can access all the relevant data sources that I may need to work with. And what's nice here is I have two connections to two different data sources open at a single time. So I have a connection to my Access data source. And when I select that as my active data source, I can see on the bottom portion of the screen, I can focus on relevant information of that data source. So likewise, if I go into my Oracle data source, I can see the relevant objects in that particular data source, and it's just a matter of selecting them to actually view that type of information. Right? Tables seem to be very, very common for folks. And what's really nice here, too, is there's different ways that I can present these collections of objects. So if you don't like a drop-down list, I'm not tied to that. I can use multi-lines of tabs or just a single row of tabs, or some folks prefer to view these things in a tree list. These are all the types of things that we can do to make understanding the objects and accessing those objects easier on us. All right. Now, one of the neat things here, too, is that when I'm working with an object, I have options that are available to me here. Now, one thing to note, when you're using a solution like Toad for Data Analyst, the types of things that I can perform on the object are going to be tied to that particular database user ID. So as I right mouse click on a particular table, we can see there are operations that I can perform. Now, if my Oracle user ID didn't have the ability to do things like alter table or drop table, I'm not going to be able to do that. All right? But assuming I can, well, those functions are going to be available to me. I can also do additional table creations, and I can create perhaps a table that's very similar to one that already exists. Maybe I need to create some sort of temporary table concept to support the types of operations that I need to do. We can also see that there are ways that we can run through a series of import or export processes. So if we have to export data from a table or import data from a file into a particular table, there are wizards that are available to us that will allow us to perform those types of operations. And I can also very, very quickly generate different types of SQL syntax. So if I know I need to go ahead and select from this selected table, I can use a solution like Toad for Data Analyst to go ahead and generate that particular SQL syntax for me, and I can use the editor to take advantage of that. And we'll talk about some additional things in the editor a little bit later. But before we do that, let's kind of take a step back here. And let's actually focus on understanding our environments. Now, when it comes to relationships, a lot of times when we're dealing with a table, there are primary foreign key constraints, that sort of referential integrity that's built into the database. So we have related tables that we may also need to work with. It's just that we may not have a clear understanding of what those relationships are. So using a solution like Toad for Data Analyst, I can specify a reference depth. How many levels deep with regards to referential integrity am I interested in really kind of modeling here? And then all I have to do is drag the table of interest and drop him onto this panel. And based on the level that I've specified, bada bing, here are related tables that I may also need to be aware of. So now I'm starting to get a picture of tables and their relationships in a nice graphical format. Now, I know there are going to be those of you that are working with environments that do not have that sort of relationship defined in the database. That gets a little trickier. Now, the tool can't infer those relationships, but what we can help you do is piece together those items of the puzzle, because you can continue to drag and drop, and maybe that was a bad example, the items or the tables that you know you need to work with. So as you're going through your day-to-day tasks, you're starting to understand some of the relationships that exist. Well, you know that there's a relationship between the parts table and the supplier table, and in fact that relationship exists based on this supplier ID. So I can use a drag and drop concept to visually represent those relationships. And one thing to note here, we're not impacting the database. So we're not creating these relationships behind the scenes. We're just giving ourselves a visual understanding of those relationships. Pretty darn cool. So in addition to be able to create those, of course, we can save them, we can retrieve them later, we can take advantage of items like the project manager, which gives us quick access to items that we may need to reference at a later date. So rather than using a file open concept to view this, I can add this diagram to the project manager, and it'll be available to me in the diagrams folder. Or I can use right mouse click to add links to existing items that I may need to reference on a regular basis. Perhaps it's a directory location that houses a lot of my SQL scripts. Let's point to that and take advantage of being able to load those right from within the tool. All right. For those of us that are detail-oriented, well, we can take a look at a detailed view of these objects. And you'll notice as I select an object, this right-hand side is going to update to reflect the details of that object. And so when it comes to working with a table, of course, I can see the different columns contained in the table. Hey, help me understand those guys so I don't have to do a select star to grab these. Right? I can see their data types, and I can continue to get as deep as I'd like to be. So examine things like constraints, the indexes for this particular table, obviously the contents of this particular table. Now what's really nice here is by default we're only going to retrieve 1,000 rows at a time. So if I'm working with this particular view against tables that have 500,000 or millions of rows, we're not going to fetch those all at once. And in fact we can apply that same sort of constraint to our queries. So if we're querying against those tables, we can only retrieve records at, let's say 1,000 rows at a time if we want to have that added safety net as we're working with our SQL syntax. Pretty cool stuff. You can group by column headers, so you can use a drag and drop concept. Let's say I want to group my data by name or continue that sort of grouping through a drag and drop. I'm going to go ahead and undo it. You may have noticed as I mouse over a column, hey, I get a little filter icon, and this is very similar to an Excel style filtering where I can select a particular record, filter my record sets according to that item, and the tool lets me know that a filter is active so I don't walk away from my desk and freak out thinking I've truncated or deleted 500,000 rows here. No, Ben, you've got a filter active. Here's the little icon letting you know that. Here's some additional information letting you know that, and you can just click on the X and remove it. Right mouse click is going to be our friend here as well because it's going to allow us to do exports of the data. And I had mentioned that Excel is going to be a pretty prominent format here. But there are other types of formats that we can generate. If we're already working with Excel on our environment, well, you can see we can go ahead and launch the particular data set into that active instance, perhaps at a very specific cell location. Maybe we want to go ahead and generate things like pivot tables or even linked queries. Right? There are other formats that we could launch using an export wizard. This is the second time we've actually seen that. So we can say, let's go ahead and specify some other relevant format here, step through a wizard-driven process that allows us to go ahead and export the data as we see fit. All right? So a lot of options in kind of working with a detailed approach of the database. All right. Now, I had mentioned a workflow. If I am working in an ER diagram and I say, you know what, these are the tables that I absolutely need to query, I can go ahead and send this collection of tables right to the graphical format that generates the SQL syntax for me. Or I can come right into the query builder and use a drag and drop point-and-click process to generate the SQL syntax. And I'll show you a different approach to that in just a moment. But what we see in the top panel, obviously, are the tables that we need to work with. And on the bottom portion of the screen, we're really kind of empty at this point. So what we need to do is we need to very quickly select, and I'd say very quickly, but we can very quickly select the columns that we're interested in working with, and we can see them extend and build out on the bottom portion of the screen. And if we're ever really curious, we can actually see the SQL syntax that's being generated for us. Okay. Now, if this is what I need, I can go ahead and execute the query interactively, and what we'll see here in just a few moments are, of course, our results in a data grid. Hey, this looks familiar. We saw a data grid earlier. Same types of operations from a filtering concept, from a drag and drop, as well as from a right-click exporting into a variety of formats. Okay. You can refine your queries further using the bottom portion of this screen. And you can see the different types of conditions that you can build here. So maybe I need to add a group by clause or an or clause, change how these items are actually sorted, maybe toggle the visibility of these various columns, or give them different aliases. If I'd rather call balance Ben, I can do that sort of thing. Right? And what's neat, as you're building these conditions, I can take a very straightforward graphical approach and I can say, I really need to limit my records to balances that are greater than or equal to 7,800. But this graphical approach may not be powerful enough. So what we may need to do is access a formula approach. Now the formula approach is still graphical in nature, but what it allows me to do is access additional functions, operators in the columns, so I can use a double click, a drag and drop, a typing type of concept to build this out a bit further. It's just we're exposing more powerful features in this formula tab. For the sake of time, we're going to keep it pretty straightforward. We can see that clause is updated. We can see our syntax is updated, and we can go ahead and re-execute this query and verify everything's the way we need it to be. All right. Now, for those of us that are working with prefer a drag and drop approach, we can take advantage of a graphical concept to do that here as well. And what's pretty neat is I can use this graphical approach to query data from different data sources. So it may be that my customers table in my Access database contains relevant customer information. But you know what? My orders information lives in my Oracle data source. So I need to grab that information there as well. So using this drag and drop concept, we can specify the tables that we want to query. And then I know what the relationship is, and I use a drag and drop to build basically that join condition. Right? Now, what's really pretty neat here is when you double-click on that join line, you can do things like change the join test, change the join type, make it inner, outer join, that sort of thing. And ultimately, we repeat the process of selecting the columns that we're interested in, and then we can go ahead and execute that particular query. And now, instead of having to use something like Excel to manipulate the data and manage it that way, I can go ahead and access these two different data sources. I know what the relationship is. Let's build that query and go ahead and execute it, and then export it appropriately. All right. Now, for those of you that are hands-on, that's okay. I could take a graphical approach, and I could say, let's go ahead and send this SQL syntax to the editor, because I'm a hands-on person. I want to generate that information. Okay? Or you can start from scratch. And what's kind of nice is there are little lookups that are available to me here. So let's say I'm working in Oracle, and I know that I need to work with this Quest Dev schema, but I can't remember what the object is. Well, I can use a dot lookup and have it look up objects in that particular schema. And I can select it from the list, and I can continue on. Right? Well, there's another approach. Now, I might remember the object starts with OW underscore, but maybe I can't remember what the rest of it is. I can do a control period on my keyboard, and I can filter that list so that it shows me objects that start with OW underscore. Save you some time here. Take a look at that and continue on. Right? If you're using aliases in your queries, hey, remember that select star to see the columns? We don't have to do that anymore. We can alias this table with O, and then when we do O period, hey, here are the columns of that table. Now I can go ahead and select these guys and continue on with everything else that I need to do. Okay, pretty neat stuff. You can also use this little object view to drag and drop. So I don't even have to really remember what the table's called. I'll just drag that guy over here and frame my syntax around him appropriately. Okay? Now, one thing that I have hidden right now, of course, are the columns of that selected table. So, hey, let's expose that. And then, once again, I don't have to take advantage of things like aliases and dot lookups to view my columns. I can see them right in this list, and I can either single select or multi-select these items, and then use a drag and drop to specify those guys here. All right. And the same sort of process that we've talked about before, we can execute our queries here, we see our results in a data grid, and we save ourselves some time along the way. What's really pretty neat for those of you that are SQL-centric, this particular solution contains samples of code that you can use to save you some time. And because this platform supports multiple data sources, we can see them broken out according to that particular platform, from DB2 to MySQL, ODBC, so on and so forth. And there are different categories that exist for each of these platforms, and it's really just a matter of taking a look at the category that makes the most sense to me. Maybe it is a single row function that I want to take a look at. And maybe it's a date time function or some sort of conversion function. And I can expand these out and see what matches my criteria. So to date, now I can't remember the format of that blasted function. Save me some time here. Well, here it is. Change the appropriate parameters and continue on with everything else that you need to do. All right? If you're a typer like me, I can use a keyboard shortcut to expose this list. It's just Control Spacebar, so I don't even have to use a drag and drop from this. I can go ahead and use my keyboard and select the appropriate item that makes the most sense to me and take advantage of that little bit of code. And for those of you that are doing this sort of thing, that may be having to write statements over and over and over again, take a look at the right mouse click functionality here, which allows you to create your own categories and to create your own snippets. So rather than having to reinvent the wheel every single time, save yourself some typing. Extend out this snippets list to make your life a little easier as you're actually building SQL syntax. Now, any statement that we've executed gets captured in what's known as the SQL recall. So this is a great example of something that I have run into in the past, which is, hey Ben, you remember that query that you wrote for me the other day or 2 weeks ago? No, I didn't save it. I thought it was something one-off that we never had to worry about again. Right? So if I've executed it in Toad for Data Analyst, it may actually appear in this SQL recall area. Now, this executed tab is volatile, meaning by default it only will keep track of the last 100 statements that have been executed. And you can extend this up to, I believe, 999. But once that threshold is crossed, it's going to start overwriting items in this executed tab. But what's nice about that is I can come back to this particular list and I can double click and I can take advantage of grabbing the SQL statement that I previously executed because it appears in that tab. Right? To save myself from that historical threshold, naturally I can save my queries, I can add them to the project, put them off somewhere that's going to get backed up so I can reuse them later, or I can right mouse click on the query and move it to the named tab, which will put it in this named tab in that same view. But basically that means that it's no longer subjected to that historical limit, and I've effectively saved me from myself by storing it in a named tab as opposed to it being subjected to that historical limit. All right. Okay. Now, in terms of being able to produce information in relevant formats, we've talked a bit about pushing things off to that Excel format or some other export format using the export wizard. There's also the ability to generate different types of reports, and depending on the data that you're working with, it might be a chart that you're having to build or some sort of pivot grid, or maybe we can step through a wizard-driven process that's actually going to kind of walk us through framing a report. And I'm going to do that very, very quickly. What columns from my result set do I want to use? Any sort of grouping that might be relevant for this type of report? What type of format may be most relevant here? What type of orientation? And naturally we have some predefined look and feel that we can take advantage of from a style perspective, and maybe we find one that's relevant to us. All right? All this is going to do for us is essentially frame a report, and what you'll notice now is I have the ability to use drag and drops to rearrange the items on this particular report, and I could take advantage of some standard items that appear in my toolbox and use drag and drop to add additional things like charts or page breaks, really truly configure this report, and then ultimately preview it to make sure that the changes that I'm making along the way are truly relevant. And we'll give this a few moments to go ahead and kind of build out here. And you'll notice we have the ability to save these things to our project file so we can reference it later or send it off to an email to somebody that may need it. You can also save these items as a variety of different formats. And PDF seems to be really common these days in terms of sharing information. All right. Now, an additional step may be automating tasks. All right. Now, what we provide is a graphical approach to building that particular automation. And what we'll see here, if I go ahead and hide that, is my automation toolbox shows me the types of activities that I can actually automate. And my automation script appears in the center of the screen. And when I select an item in the automation script, I'm going to see properties about that item on the right-hand side. So from an overall script setting, if this particular script fails, I may want to send an email. And I can configure that type of operation using this right-hand side properties menu. I'm going to run you through a really quick example here or I'm specifying my connection. So what connection, what database connection do I want to use as part of this operation? And we can specify that sort of information. And then I'm going to automate the process of executing a SQL file and saving the results as an Excel file. At any point when I'm building an automation script, I can actually see where I need to supply additional information. So I can say, okay, you know, what type of information have I missed? Well, I got to tell it what script to execute and where I want this file to live. That's easy. That's on the right-hand side. And we can select these particular items. We can select them if they're appearing in our project manager, or we can browse to their location on our file system. And we'll just make something up here. Neat. Horrible naming convention. I would encourage you to use better naming conventions than what I'm using. And you notice there are other activities here that we could do. I mean, as a final phase of this, I could send this as an email to somebody. I could also execute some other program. Maybe I need to, you know, FTP this off somewhere. So there are all kinds of different activities that you can perform. And ultimately, I need to go ahead and test this and make sure that, you know what, my automation script's going to execute as I expect before I take the next step, which may be something along the lines of actually scheduling this to run at some other time. So using kind of an interactive testing process, we're beginning to see our export succeeded appropriately. We actually have a hyperlink to the Excel file, so we could view that file, verify everything's exactly the way we need it to be, and then we can choose to go ahead and schedule this to run at a time of our choosing. Now, when you're automating these types of redundant tasks, you know, basically we're automating them and wrapping them as Windows tasks on your local machine. So they're not going to be configuring necessarily on the server. They're going to be configuring via a Windows task on the local machine. So you want to kind of keep that in mind as you're using the solution. All right. So save ourselves some steps. We can have this executed some other time. And maybe a silly example is, you know what, I fire this off at 2 o'clock in the morning. My boss gets an email at 2:30 from me with the information my boss needs. And now all of a sudden my boss thinks I'm working really hard here. And that's valuable information come pay raise and review time, right? All right, cheesy example. The jokes don't get any better. I have to apologize in advance for that. Something else, for those of you that are having to really worry about, you know, data being similar in environments and reacting to potential differences, there is a data compare and synchronization wizard that you can work through. And what you have the ability to do here is specify sort of what you're considering to be your source environment, and then what you're considering to be your target environment. And maybe it's in the same data source, or maybe it's across data sources, right? So we can walk through this process, and in just a few moments we'll actually have a list of objects that we can kind of specify that we want to verify the data is similar, and we want to react to those differences. So bear with me one moment. So I see a list of my source objects. And then as I come into selecting the target item, I just need to say, hey, what do you want to compare it to? And what's nice is the tool will try to do its best in terms of being able to match what that key column is. But if I'm doing this across different data sources, I may have to come in here and actually supply which key it is that I want to compare. I can also specify the columns that I want to include in this comparison. I may not want to include all the columns from these tables. It may only be certain ones. So you can use checkboxes to do that sort of thing. And let me just grab a couple of these guys here from the list, and then I'll go ahead and click on step through this wizard, and what we have is basically a summary of what our differences are. Now, the double arrows are showing us data that exists in both the source and the target environment that's different. Additional shows me records that exist in my source but do not exist in my target. Missing shows me data that exists in my target but does not exist in my source. Well, all right, well, that's a nice little summary, but let's actually look at what's going on. So across the top of the page here, we can actually see the tables that we were interested in looking at. And when I select a table on the bottom portion of the screen, I can filter out the type of information that I want to display here. So depending on the extent of those differences, we can very easily filter the volume of information that we're looking at. And then when we select a record, we can very easily focus on what's different. We can see that our name column is different between source and data. And then we can take a synchronization step. So we can say, what tables do we want to synchronize? And we can get very granular and say, well, what data within those tables do we want to synchronize? It's a checkbox concept. And then we step through a wizard-driven process that basically allows us to specify the direction we want to go. So do I want to make my target look like my source? Do I want to make my source look like my target? And the graphic updates to let us know kind of what's going on. And then we can choose to go ahead and view this script, make changes to it if we need to run it immediately, or just, you know what, let's not take any action right now. Let's just go ahead and save it and continue on with all the other things that we need to do. So for those of us that are concerned with data cleanliness, you know, this is the type of thing that could be very, very helpful. All right. And now I'm going to go ahead and shift gears here and pop back into my presentation. So bear with me as I attempt to do that. So in kind of summarizing what we've talked about, we have a graphical approach that we can take to actually generate the SQL syntax for us, or at least get us started, because we have a fully functional editor that we can use to go ahead and build out that particular SQL syntax. We can take advantage of connecting to multiple data sources along the way. All right. And of course, we can automate different types of tasks to save ourselves some time where we're finding ourselves having to repeat ourselves over and over and over again, and we can offload that execution to some other time of our choosing. So, you know, my feeling is that in terms of supporting your efforts as a data detective, a solution like Toad for Data Analyst can really help you along the way in terms of managing differences between data, importing data, exporting data from different data sources, helping you generate the appropriate SQL syntax, but still allowing you to take advantage of your skill set to expand that out even further, ultimately, you know, making you look like the hero along the way. All right. So if this has really sparked your interest and you want to get your hands on this solution, it's completely trialable. So you can go out to quest.com/toad4dataanalysts and get your hands on this solution and go ahead and trial it. You know, it's fully functional for 30 days. And in fact, it looks as though that on our quest.com/the Data Detective series, you have a chance to register and win a 1-year license of this particular solution. So if you want to play that game, feel free to please do so. A couple of other community websites that could be appropriate. Toadworld.com, excellent resource. I have a blog out there. I'll toot my own horn a little bit. So I have written things about, hey, did you know you could do this with a solution like Toad for Data Analyst? We also have experts in the data analysis world, as well as the Oracle world, SQL optimization, all kinds of great free content available on toadworld.com. For a more Toad for Data Analyst focus, there's a community website that's listed here at tda.inside.quest.com. So you can interact with other users of Toad for Data Analysts, and you can also interact with the developers on the solution set. Hey, that's pretty cool. All right. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and use the questions function and open the floor up for questions. So what type of questions do you guys have? How else can I help you understand kind of what we're doing here? And Adrian, if I'm not mistaken, they have the ability to use the questions feature within the little Citrix console, correct?
That's correct. You can submit your questions using the questions feature, and looks like there are a number of questions already queued in.
So let me kind of go through this. So, and now, of course, I have to expand this out a little bit so I can actually see. We're going to hide that. And let me see if I can see that. Let's see here. Oops, that's not what I wanted. So part of this is user error on my part to try to read these things. All right. All right, so let's see. I'm trying to kind of sort through there. So is the bind variable concept usable across databases, say SQL Server and Oracle? Yes, it is, though the syntax associated with the bind variable may be slightly different. I've had some luck using kind of like a colon variable concept. So select star from, table where ID equal colon ID. And then when you execute those, you get a little prompt that says, supply the particular variable in question. So each platform does provide a kind of a bind variable concept. And I believe within a solution like Toad for Data Analyst, you should be able to use kind of a colon bind variable to actually describe that particular process. Another question, is this a Windows-only application? Absolutely. It is a Windows-only application. And is there a free software? Well, so there is a freeware version of Toad for Data Analyst that is available, though you'll find that it actually has kind of truncated functionality, but it is freeware. Otherwise, it is also available as a licensed solution. All right. All right, so Ellen's asking, their company uses Toad for Oracle, the Expert Edition, and is Toad Data Analyst an entirely different product? In fact, yes, it is an entirely different product. It's a product that really kind of focuses on an audience that needs to work with data, to understand, to query, and report. And in fact, they have the ability to connect to multiple data sources from this particular solution. Now, what's interesting to know, with that particular version of Toad for Oracle that you're using, 10.0, in fact, I think it was around version 9.6 or even version 9.7 of Toad for Oracle, we include the ability to use Toad for Data Analysts for free along with that particular configuration of Toad for Oracle. So if I have a Toad for Oracle license, I have the ability to use Toad for Data Analysts for free. And in fact, when you're installing these later versions of Toad for Oracle, Toad for Data Analysts appears in the installation dialog that would allow you to obviously install that separately. It does exist as a separate EXE, and you may have noticed that it has a different look and feel, but it is entirely a separate application. Okay. All right. So Rajan is asking, what are the different versions of this tool? What different versions of this tool are available, and what is the pricing? So we've talked about a free version, and there is a free version available that is, like I said, has truncated functionality, so you won't be able to do everything that we talked about here. And there are not different, if you will, editions of this particular tool. Like, for example, some of our other solutions like Toad for SQL Server or Toad for DB2 or Toad for Oracle come in different editions, like a standard edition or a professional edition or an expert edition. Toad for Data Analysts is Toad for Data Analysts. And in fact, the latest version, and when I think version, I think of the numerical value of the EXE itself, is 2.6.1. So hopefully that addresses the issue with regards to, are there different versions that are available? All right. So one of the questions from, let's see, can't get the whole view over here, from Nas is, can multiple users view peer queries and run this application at the same time? So you might have noticed that in the project manager, one of the things that you have the ability to do is to point to a particular location. So I can build basically a link to a file. Right. So it could be that as I'm building queries, I'm saving these things out to, let's say, a network share or something along those lines. So I could open a query that exists on that sort of network share through the solution, through Toad for Data Analysts, and actually execute this particular solution, or execute that particular query. So I'm not really sure if that's what you're asking, but yes, I do have the ability to just do like a file open operation, and if I've stored queries out on a network share or something along those lines, I have the ability to do that sort of thing. And we've seen a few questions now with really how much does it cost? Well, that's a good question, and I honestly can't remember what the cost of the solution is. I believe it's under $500, but don't quote me on that. With anything sales related, you can always talk to your sales rep at Quest to get a better feel for pricing, because they'll do things like volume queries and that sort of thing. So something else to kind of think about. All right. So someone's asking, can I put up the previous slide? So I'm assuming that means, let's go back to this particular slide where you're talking about where to get additional information. All right, so there's a question from Sahil saying Toad goes to a hang state when running queries retrieving large amount of data. Same query running on a Unix, so via the command line. Is something being done regarding this aspect or issue? I'm not really sure I understand the issue there. So one of the things to consider is there is an option in Toad for Data Analyst to limit the number of records that's retrieved at a particular time when you're executing a query through something like the editor. So let's see if I can toggle on over here and locate that particular option. So you may have remembered, let's see here, in general, no, let's see. Okay. So hopefully you're seeing these options okay. You'll notice that number of rows to initially fetch in Data tab. So as you're kind of poking around and taking a look at data, in that Data tab in something like the Database Explorer, we're only going to fetch 1,000 rows. There's an option here to apply that particular issue, that particular constraint to the editor, and what that will allow you to do is basically when I execute a particular query, it's only going to fetch 1,000 rows at a time. So that may be something that you can apply to take a look and see if that addresses your particular issue. The other thing to note here too is if you guys are current on licensing, you always have the ability to reach out to our technical support group. So if you're having questions or problems with the solution, don't let yourself get frustrated. Reach out to support.quest.com and work with our technical support folks and, take advantage of those types of resources. And I can see now that it's 2 o'clock, and so what I need to do is go ahead and hand this back over to Adrian. So, Adrian, ball's in your court, sir.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for a very informative presentation. And thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days of the event. This concludes today's event, and again, we hope you have a great day.